the various factors of the labor process play different parts in forming the value of the product. The laborer adds fresh value to the subject of his labor by expending upon it a given amount of additional labor, no matter what the specific character and utility of that labor may be. On the other hand, the values of the means of production used up in the process are preserved and present themselves afresh as constituent parts of the value of the product. The values of the cotton and the spindle, for instance, reappear again in the value of the yarn. The value of the means of production is therefore preserved by being transferred to the product. This transfer takes place during the conversion of those means into a product, or in other words, during the labor process. It is brought about by labor, but how? The laborer does not perform two operations at once, one in order to add value to the cotton, the other in order to preserve the value of the means of production, or, what amounts to the same thing, to transfer to the yarn, to the product, the value of the cotton on which he works, and part of the value of the spindle with which he works. But by the very act of adding new value, he preserves their former values. Since, however, the addition of new value to the subject of his labor and the preservation of its former value are two entirely distinct results, produced simultaneously by the laborer, during one operation, it is plain that this twofold nature of the result can be explained only by the twofold nature of his labor. At one and the same time, it must in one character create value, and in another character preserve or transfer value. Now, in what manner does every laborer add new labor and consequently new value? Evidently only by laboring productively in a particular way, the spinner by spinning, the weaver by weaving, the smith by forging. But while thus incorporating labor generally, that is value, it is by the particular form alone of the labor, by the spinning, the weaving, and the forging respectively, that the means of production, the cotton and spindle, the yarn and loom, and the iron and anvil become constituent elements of the product, of a new use value. Each use value disappears, but only to reappear under a new form and a new use value. Now we saw, when we were considering the process of creating value, that if a use value be effectively consumed in the production of a new use value, the quantity of labor expended in the production of the consumed article forms a portion of the quantity of labor necessary to produce the new use value. This portion is therefore labor transferred from the means of production to the new product. Hence, the laborer preserves the values of the consumed means of production, or transfers them as portions of its value to the product, not by virtue of his additional labor, abstractedly considered, but by virtue of the particular useful character of that labor, by virtue of its special productive form. In so far then as labor is such specific productive activity, in so far as it is spinning, weaving, or forging, it raises, by mere contact, the means of production from the dead, makes them living factors of the labor process, and combines with them to form the new products. If the special productive labor of the workman were not spinning, he could not convert the cotton into yarn, and therefore could not transfer the values of the cotton and spindle to the yarn. Suppose the same workman were to change his occupation to that of a joiner, he would still by a day's labor add value to the material he works upon. Consequently, we see first that the addition of new value takes place not by virtue of his labor being spinning in particular, or joinering in particular, but because it is labor in the abstract, a portion of the total labor of society, and we see next that the value added is of a given definite amount, not because his labor has a special utility, but because it is exerted for a definite time. On the one hand, then, it is by virtue of its general character, as being expenditure of human labor power in the abstract, that spinning adds new value to the values of the cotton and the spindle, and on the other hand, it is by virtue of its special character, as being a concrete, useful process, that the same labor of spinning both transfers the values of the means of production to the product, and preserves them in the product. Hence at one and the same time there is produced a twofold result. By the simple addition of a certain quantity of labor, new value is added, and by the quality of this added labor, the original values of the means of production are preserved in the product. This twofold effect, resulting from the twofold character of labor, may be traced in various phenomena. Let us assume that some invention enables the spinner to spin as much cotton in hours as he was able to spin before an hour. His labor is now 6 times as effective as it was, for the purposes of useful production. The product of hours' work has increased 6-fold, from pound to pounds, but now the pounds of cotton absorb only the same amount of labor as formerly did the pounds. 1/6 as much new labor is absorbed by each pound of cotton, and consequently, the value added by the labor to each pound is only 1/6 of what it formerly was. On the other hand, in the product in the pounds, Of yarn, the value transferred from the cotton is 6 times as great as before. By the hour spinning, the value of the raw material preserved and transferred to the product is 6 times as great as before, although the new value added by the labor of the spinner to each pound of the very same raw material is 1/6 what it was formerly. This shows that the two properties of labor, by virtue of which it is enabled in one case to preserve value and in the other to create value, are essentially different. On the one hand, the longer the time necessary to spin a given weight of cotton into yarn, the greater is the new value added to the material. On the other hand, the greater the weight of the cotton spun in a given time, the greater is the value preserved by being transferred from it to the product. Let us now assume that the productiveness of the spinner's labor, instead of varying, remains constant, that he therefore requires the same time as he formerly did to convert 1 pound of cotton into yarn, but that the exchange value of the cotton varies, either by rising to 6 times its former value or falling to 1/6 of that value. In both these cases, the spinner puts the same quantity of labor into a pound of cotton, and therefore adds as much value as he did before the change in the value. He also produces a given weight of yarn in the same time as he did before. Nevertheless, the value that he transfers from the cotton to the yarn is either 1/6 of what it was before the variation, or, as the case may be, 6 times as much as before. The same result occurs when the value of the instruments of labor rises or falls, while their useful efficacy in the process remains unaltered. Again, if the technical conditions of the spinning process remain unchanged, and no change of value takes place in the means of production, the spinner continues to consume in equal working times equal quantities of raw material and equal quantities of machinery of unvarying value. The value that he preserves in the product is directly proportional to the new value that he adds to the product. In 2 weeks he incorporates twice as much labor, and therefore twice as much value, as in 1 week, and during the same time he consumes twice as much material, and wears out twice as much machinery, of double the value in each case. He therefore preserves, in the product of 2 weeks, twice as much value as in the product of 1 week. So long as the conditions of production remain the same, the more value the laborer adds by fresh labor, the more value he transfers and preserves. But he does so merely because this addition of new value takes place under conditions that have not varied and are independent of his own labor. Of course, it may be said in one sense that the laborer preserves old value always in proportion to the quantity of new value that he adds. Whether the value of cotton rise from 1 shilling to 2 shillings or fall to 6pence, the workman invariably preserves in the product of 1 hour only 1/2 as much value as he preserves in 2 hours. In like manner, if the productiveness of his own labor varies by rising or falling, he will in 1 hour spin either more or less cotton, as the case may be, than he did before, and will consequently preserve in the product of 1 hour more or less value of cotton, but all the same, he will preserve by 2 hours labor twice as much value as he will by 1. Value exists only in articles of utility. In objects, we leave out of consideration its purely symbolical representation by token. If therefore an article loses its utility, it also loses its value. The reason why means of production do not lose their value, at the same time that they lose their use value, is this: they lose in the labor process the original form of their use value, only to assume in the product the form of a new use value. But however important it may be to value, that it should have some object of utility to embody itself in, yet it is a matter of complete indifference what particular object serves this purpose. This we saw when treating of the metamorphosis of commodity. Hence it follows that in the labor process, the means of production transfer their value to the product, only so far as along with their use value, they lose also their exchange value. They give up to the product that value alone which they themselves lose as means of production. But in this respect the material factors of the labor process do not all behave alike. The coal burnt under the boiler vanishes without leaving a trace, so too, the tallow with which the axles of wheels are greased. Dye-stuffs and other auxiliary substances also vanish, but reappear as properties of the product. Raw material forms the substance of the product, but only after it has changed its form. Hence raw material and auxiliary substances lose the characteristic form with which they are clothed on entering the labor process. It is otherwise with the instruments of labor. Tools, machines, workshops, and vessels are of use in the labor process only so long as they retain their original shape and are ready each morning to renew the process with their shape unchanged. And just as during their lifetime, that is to say, during the continued labor process in which they serve, they retain their shape independent of the product. So too, they do after their death. The corpses of machines, tools, workshops, and are always separate and distinct from the product they help to turn out. If we now consider the case of any instrument of labor during the whole period of its service, from the day of its entry into the workshop till the day of its banishment into the lumber room, we find that during this period its use value has been completely consumed, and therefore its exchange value completely transferred to the product. For instance, if a spinning machine lasts for years, it is plain that during that working period its total value is gradually transferred to the product of the year. The lifetime of an instrument of labor, therefore, is spent in the repetition of a greater or less number of similar operations. Its life may be compared with that of a human being. Every day brings a man hours nearer to his grave, but how many days he has still to travel on that road, no man can tell accurately by merely looking at it. This difficulty, however, does not prevent life insurance offices from drawing, by means of the theory of averages, very accurate, and at the same time very profitable conclusions. So it is with the instruments of labor. It is known by experience how long on the average a machine of a particular kind will last. Suppose its use value in the labor process to last only 6 days. Then, on the average, it loses each day 1/6 of its use value, and therefore parts with 1/6 of its value to the daily product. The wear and tear of all instruments, their daily loss of use value, and the corresponding quantity of value they part with to the product, are accordingly calculated upon this basis. It is thus strikingly clear that means of production never transfer more value to the product than they themselves lose during the labor process by the destruction of their own use value. If such an instrument has no value to lose, if, in other words, it is not the product of human labor, it transfers no value to the product. It helps to create use value without contributing to the formation of exchange value. In this class are included all means of production supplied by nature without human assistance, such as land, wind, water, metals in situ, and timber in virgin forests. Yet another interesting phenomenon here presents itself. Suppose a machine to be worth £1, and to wear out in days. Then 1,000th part of the value of the machine is daily transferred to the day's product. At the same time, though with diminishing vitality, the machine as a whole continues to take part in the labor process. Thus it appears that one factor of the labor process, a means of production, continually enters as a whole into that process, while it enters into the process of the formation of value by fractions only. The difference between the two processes is here reflected in their material factors, by the same instrument of production taking part as a whole in the labor process, while at the same time as an element in the formation of value, it enters only by fraction. On the other hand, a means of production may take part as a whole in the formation of value, while into the labor process it enters only bit by bit. Suppose that in spinning cotton, the waste for every pound used amounts to pounds, which is converted not into yarn but into devil's dust. Now, although this pounds of cotton never becomes a constituent element of the yarn, yet assuming this amount of waste to be normal and inevitable under average conditions of spinning, its value is just as surely transferred to the value of the yarn as is the value of the pound. That form the substance of the yarn. The use value of pounds of cotton must vanish into dust before pound of yarn can be made. The destruction of this cotton is therefore a necessary condition in the production of the yarn. And because it is a necessary condition, and for no other reason, the value of that cotton is transferred to the product. The same holds good for every kind of refuse resulting from a labor process, so far at least as such refuse cannot be further employed as a means in the production of new and independent use value. Such an employment of refuse may be seen in the large machine works at Manchester, where mountains of iron turnings are carted away to the foundry in the evening, in order the next morning to reappear in the workshops as solid masses of iron. We have seen that the means of production transfer value to the new product, so far only as during the labor process they lose value in the shape of their old use value. The maximum loss of value that they can suffer in the process is plainly limited by the amount of the original value with which they came into the process, or in other words, by the labor time necessary for their production. Therefore, the means of production can never add more value to the product than they themselves possess independently of the process in which they assist. However useful a given kind of raw material or a machine or other means of production may be, though it may cost pound, or say, day's labor, yet it cannot, under any circumstances, add to the value of the product more than pound. Its value is determined not by the labor process into which it enters as a means of production, but by that out of which it is issued as a product. In the labor process, it only serves as a mere use value, a thing with useful properties, and could not, therefore, transfer any value to the product, unless it possessed such value previously. While productive labor is changing the means of production into constituent elements of a new product, their value undergoes a metempsychosis. It deserts the consumed body to occupy the newly created one. But this transmigration takes place, as it were, behind the back of the laborer. He is unable to add new labor, to create new value, without at the same time preserving old values. And this, because the labor he adds must be of a specific useful kind, and he cannot do work of a useful kind, without employing products as the means of production of a new product, and thereby transferring their value to the new product. The property, therefore, which labor power in action, living labor, possesses of preserving value, at the same time that it adds it, is a gift of nature which costs the laborer nothing, but which is very advantageous to the capitalist inasmuch as it preserves the existing value of his capital. So long as trade is good, the capitalist is too much absorbed in money-grubbing to take notice of this gratuitous gift of labor. A violent interruption of the labor process by a crisis makes him sensitively aware of it. As regards the means of production, what is really consumed is their use value, and the consumption of this use value by labor results in the product. There is no consumption of their value, and it would therefore be inaccurate to say that it is reproduced. It is rather preserved, not by reason of any operation it undergoes itself in the process, but because the article in which it originally exists vanishes, it is true, but vanishes into some other article. Hence, in the value of the product, there is a reappearance of the value of the means of production, but there is, strictly speaking, no reproduction of that value. That which is produced is a new use value in which the old exchange value reappears. It is otherwise with the subjective factor of the labor process, with labor power in action. While the laborer, by virtue of his labor being of a specialized kind that has a special object, preserves and transfers to the product the value of the means of production, he at the same time, by the mere act of working, creates each instant an additional or new value. Suppose the process of production to be stopped just when the workman has produced an equivalent for the value of his own labor power, when, for example, by 6 hours' labor, he has added a value of 3 shillings. This value is the surplus of the total value of the product over the portion of its value that is due to the means of production. It is the only original bit of value formed during this process, the only portion of the value of the product created by this process. Of course, we do not forget that this new value only replaces the money advanced by the capitalist in the purchase of the labor power, and spent by the laborer on the necessaries of life. With regard to the money spent, the new value is merely a reproduction, but nevertheless it is an actual, and not, as in the case of the value of the means of production, only an apparent reproduction. Substitution of one value for another is here effected by the creation of new value. We know, however, from what has gone before, that the labor process may continue beyond the time necessary to reproduce and incorporate in the product a mere equivalent for the value of the labor power. Instead of the 6 hours that are sufficient for the latter purpose, the process may continue for 12 hours. The action of labor power, therefore, not only reproduces its own value, but produces value over and above it. This surplus value is the difference between the value of the product and the value of the elements consumed in the formation of that product, in other words, of the means of production and the labor power. Our explanation of the different parts played by the various factors of the labor process in the formation of the product's value, we have, in fact, disclosed the characters of the different functions allotted to the different elements of capital in the process of expanding its own value. The surplus of the total value of the product, over the sum of the values of its constituent factors, is the surplus of the expanded capital over the capital originally advanced. The means of production on the one hand, labor power on the other, are merely the different modes of existence which the value of the original capital assumed, when from being money it was transformed into the various factors of the labor process. That part of capital, then, which is represented by the means of production, by the raw material, auxiliary material, and the instruments of labor does not, in the process of production, undergo any quantitative alteration of value. I therefore call it the constant part of capital, or more shortly, constant capital. On the other hand, that part of capital represented by labor power does, in the process of production, undergo an alteration of value. It both reproduces the equivalent of its own value and also produces an excess, a surplus value which may itself vary, may be more or less according to circumstances. This part of capital is continually being transformed from a constant into a variable magnitude. I therefore call it the variable part of capital, or shortly, variable capital. The same elements of capital which, from the point of view of the labor process, present themselves respectively as the objective and subjective factors, as means of production and labor power, present themselves, from the point of view of the process of creating surplus value, as constant and variable capital. The definition of constant capital given above by no means excludes the possibility of a change of value in its elements. Suppose the price of cotton to be one day 6 pence a pound, and the next day, in consequence of a failure of the cotton crop, a shilling a pound. Each pound of the cotton bought at 6 pence, and worked up after the rise in value, transfers to the product a value of 1 shilling, and the cotton already spun before the rise, and perhaps circulating in the market as yarn, likewise transfers to the product twice its original value. It is plain, however, that these changes of value are independent of the increment or surplus value added to the value of the cotton by the spinning itself. If the old cotton had never been spun, it could, after the rise, be resold at a shilling a pound instead of at 6 pence. Further, the fewer the processes the cotton has gone through, the more certain is this result. We therefore find that speculators make it a rule when such sudden changes in value occur, to speculate in that material on which the least possible quantity of labor has been spent, to speculate, therefore, in yarn rather than in cloth, in cotton itself, rather than in yarn. The change of value in the case we have been considering originates, not in the process in which the cotton plays the part of a means of production, and in which it therefore functions as constant capital, but in the process in which the cotton itself is produced. The value of a commodity, it is true, is determined by the quantity of labor contained in it, but this quantity is itself limited by social condition. If the time socially necessary for the production of any commodity alters, and a given weight of cotton represents, after a bad harvest, more labor than after a good one, all previously existing commodities of the same class are affected, because they are, as it were, only individuals of the species, and their value at any given time is measured by the labor socially necessary, by the labor necessary for their production under the then existing social condition. As the value of the raw material may change, so, too, may that of the instruments of labor of the machinery, and employed in the process, and consequently that portion of the value of the product transferred to it from them, may also change. If in consequence of a new invention, machinery of a particular kind can be produced by a diminished expenditure of labor, the old machinery becomes depreciated more or less, and consequently transfers so much less value to the product. Here again, the change in value originates outside the process in which the machine is acting as a means of production. Once engaged in this process, the machine cannot transfer more value than it possesses apart from the process. Just as a change in the value of the means of production, even after they have commenced to take a part in the labor process, does not alter their character as constant capital, so, too, a change in the proportion of constant to variable capital does not affect the respective functions of these two kinds of capital. The technical conditions of the labor process may be revolutionized to such an extent that where formerly 10 men using 10 implements of small value worked up a relatively small quantity of raw material, one man may now, with the aid of one expensive machine, work up 100 times as much raw material. In the latter case, we have an enormous increase in the constant capital that is represented by the total value of the means of production used, and at the same time a great reduction in the variable capital invested in labor power. Such a revolution, however, alters only the quantitative relation between the constant and the variable capital, or the proportions in which the total capital is split up into its constant and variable constituents. It has not in the least degree affected the essential difference between the two. The surplus value generated in the process of production by C, the capital advanced, or in other words, the self-expansion of the value of the capital C, presents itself for our consideration, in the first place, as a surplus, as the amount by which the value of the product exceeds the value of its constituent element. What has gone before, we know that surplus value is purely the result of a variation in the value of V, of that portion of the capital which is transformed into labor power. Consequently, V plus S equals V plus V, or V plus an increment of but the fact that it is V alone that varies, and the conditions of that variation are obscured by the circumstance that in consequence of the increase in the variable component of the capital, There is also an increase in the sum total of the advanced capital. It was originally pound and becomes pound. Therefore, in order that our investigation may lead to accurate results, we must make abstraction from that portion of the value of the product, in which constant capital alone appears, and consequently must equate the constant capital to zero or make C equals. This is merely an application of a mathematical rule, employed whenever we operate with constant and variable magnitudes, related to each other by the symbols of addition and subtraction only. At first sight it appears a strange proceeding, to equate the constant capital to zero. Yet it is what we do every day. If, for example, we wish to calculate the amount of England's profits from the cotton industry, we first of all deduct the sums paid for cotton to the United States, India, Egypt, and other countries. In other words, the value of the capital that merely reappears in the value of the product is put equals. Of course, the ratio of surplus value not only to that portion of the capital from which it immediately springs, and whose change of value it represents, but also to the sum total of the capital advanced is economically of very great importance. We shall therefore, in the third book, treat of this ratio exhaustively. In order to enable one portion of a capital to expand its value by being converted into labor power, it is necessary that another portion be converted into means of production. In order that variable capital may perform its function, constant capital must be advanced in proper proportion, a proportion given by the special technical conditions of each labor process. The circumstance, however, that retorts and other vessels are necessary to a chemical process does not compel the chemist to notice them in the result of his analysis. If we look at the means of production, in their relation to the creation of value, and to the variation in the quantity of value, apart from anything else, they appear simply as the material in which labor power, the value creator, incorporates itself. Neither the nature nor the value of this material is of any importance. The only requisite is that there be a sufficient supply to absorb the labor expended in the process of production. That supply once given, the material may rise or fall in value, or even be, as land and the sea, without any value in itself, but this will have no influence on the creation of value or on the variation in the quantity of value. During the second period of the labor process, that in which his labor is no longer necessary labor, the workman, it is true, labors, expends labor power, but his labor being no longer necessary labor, he creates no value for himself. He creates surplus value which, for the capitalist, has all the charms of a creation out of nothing. This portion of the working day I name surplus labor time, and to the labor expended during that time, I give the name of surplus labor. It is every bit as important, for a correct understanding of surplus value, to conceive it as a mere congelation of surplus labor time, as nothing but materialized surplus labor, as it is, for a proper comprehension of value, to conceive it as a mere congelation of so many hours of labor, as nothing but materialized labor. The essential difference between the various economic forms of society, between, for instance, a society based on slave labor and one based on wage labor, lies only in the mode in which this surplus labor is in each case extracted from the actual producer, the laborer. Since on the one hand, the values of the variable capital and of the labor power purchased by that capital are equal, and the value of this labor power determines the necessary portion of the working day, and since, on the other hand, the surplus value is determined by the surplus portion of the working day, it follows that surplus value bears the same ratio to variable capital that surplus labor does to necessary labor, or in other words, the rate of surplus value. S divided by V equals divided by. Both ratios, S divided by V and divided by, express the same thing in different ways, in the one case by reference to materialized, incorporated labor, in the other by reference to living, fluent labor. The rate of surplus value is therefore an exact expression for the degree of exploitation of labor power by capital, or of the laborer by the capitalist. Though the method is so simple, yet it may not be amiss, by means of a few examples, to exercise the reader in the application of the novel principles underlying. One more example. Jacob gives the following calculation for the year. Owing to the previous adjustment of several items, it is very imperfect. Nevertheless, for our purpose, it is sufficient. In it, he assumes the price of wheat to be a quarter and the average yield per acre to be bushels.